model was domestic government. If you commit a crime against your neighbor, if you, heaven forbid, should break into your apartment and steal your television, what do you do? Do you grab a gun and go after him? Well, you're not supposed to. No, you're supposed to call up the police and say there's been a robbery and I've lost my stereo. And I think I saw this guy steal it. And he was wearing a white long-sleeve t-shirt and he looked kind of suspicious and he was carting this TV out under his arm. And I think he goes to Grand Valley State. And so the police come in and they check fingerprints and they ID him. They go arrest him and he gets put in the slammer. And do you know how many of you watch Law and Order? Everybody watches Law and Order, right? Do you know how they begin the proceedings? What's your name?
Danielle.
Danielle. Does Jack McCoy, or when they announce the trial, would they say, Danielle against, what's your name?
Casey.
Danielle versus Casey. Is that the way they announce trials on Law and Order and criminal court? How do they announce them? The state of New York against Casey. And this is very important because you have been injured. Your TV has been stolen, but you personally don't get to go after Casey. The state of Michigan goes after Casey. That's critical because you have surrendered a certain amount of, you could call your personal sovereignty to the state. And you agree, no, I'm not picking up a gun and going after him. I'm going to call the police and they're going to go after him. And the state of Michigan is the one who prosecutes him because he violated the peace and order of the state of Michigan. You happen to be the party to that, but he's the one who violated, and it's the people or the state of New York against Casey. And he goes to the slammer because he violated the peace of the state of Michigan. This was the model for the League of Nations. If Mexico attacked Nicaragua, Nicaragua wouldn't take it upon itself to attack Mexico back. Nicaragua would appeal to the League of Nations and say, we've been injured. And the League of Nations would say, okay, yeah, Mexico, you're in the wrong, and we're going to punish you. Now, you're a law-abiding fellow. You're not going to steal Danielle's TV, are you?
No, of course not.
And mostly because you're a good guy.
Of course.
But also because you fear the wrath of the state of Michigan. Mexico's not going to attack Nicaragua because Mexico is peace-loving. Maybe. But also, why not? At least if the League of Nations model works. Because they know the League of Nations is going to come after them. Mexico doesn't have to fear Nicaragua, but it does have to fear the League of Nations. Because the League of Nations includes all the major powers on earth, including the United Nations. That's the idea. That was Wilson's dream. Because you must remember that in 1918, as they tallied up the dead from the First World War, and they numbered in the millions, nearly everybody believed that human civilization could not survive another such war. So we got to do anything we can to make sure that no other war occurs. How are we going to do it? We got to change the model. The old model of letting nations slug it out among themselves, this isn't working. This is killing lots of people and it's going to destroy civilization. Wilson proposes this new idea, the League of Nations. The trouble is that Americans were rather put off by the formation of the League of Nations, by some of the rules, including the fact that it specified that if Mexico did attack Nicaragua, American troops might have to go punish Mexico. And a lot of Americans at the end of the First World War are beginning to think this war wasn't such a good idea in the first place, and then they began to ask themselves, well, why should American soldiers go fight in Mexico for something Mexico did to Nicaragua? They could say, they wouldn't have put it in exactly these terms, but they might have. They could say, well, I can see the altruism in that. Yeah, that's good. But where's the self-interest? Because it's got to be good for them and good for us. And they just said, I don't see enough good for us. So when Wilson brought the peace treaty from World War I home and handed it to the Senate, You know, when the United States signs a treaty, and the treaty is going to become law, it involves a two-step process. The first step is for the President to sign the treaty. What's the second step? What other branch of government gets involved? Congress. And what House of Congress in particular? Who ratifies treaties? The U.S. Senate. The Senate ratifies treaties, and in fact the treaties have to be ratified not by a simple majority, not just by 51 senators, but by a 2/3 majority, by 67 senators. And that's a big hurdle to get over. Why such a big hurdle? This is where history comes back and bites us. Because in 1787, when the current Constitution, the only Constitution we've lived under, when the current Constitution was written, the people who wrote the Constitution did not think that foreign affairs would play a large role in American politics or American life, because the United States was far away from Europe and there weren't any important powers nearby. So they wanted to make sure that the United States did not lightly enter into treaties with other countries. What this meant was that if you're going to get a treaty, it's got to get a whole lot of support. Wilson got more than a majority of support for the treaty at the end of World War I. It was called the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is a suburb of Paris where the treaty was signed. But he didn't get the supermajority. He didn't get his 2/3. As a result, the United States did not join the League of Nations. And as a result, this business of the United States joining other countries to go after Mexico if Mexico attacked Nicaragua did not come about. And as a result, Casey was allowed to run amok and steal Danielle's TV whenever he wanted, because he didn't have to worry about the rest of us coming after him. Okay, that's the second president and the second war. And the lesson there is Woodrow Wilson took more time to educate the American people to what was at stake in the war, but it turned out not quite enough. Because the support for the war lasted through the war, but it didn't last through the peace. He didn't really change American thinking. If he had changed American thinking, then the U.S. would have joined the League of Nations, and Woodrow Wilson would have gotten the beginnings of this world government. Okay, third president, third war. The third president is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the third war is World War II. By the way, do you know when World War I was first called World War I? When World War II began. In fact, I'm writing this book on Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm trying to figure out how to label World War I. But when I'm writing about the 1920s and 1930s, I can't call it World War I yet, because that presupposes a World War II. What it was generally called was either the World War or the Great War. But later it would be called World War I once there's a World War II. Franklin Roosevelt watched very closely the experiences of Theodore Roosevelt and of Woodrow Wilson. He watched the experience of Franklin Roosevelt watched the experience of Theodore Roosevelt, because Theodore Roosevelt was his cousin, his fifth cousin. And Franklin Roosevelt was often invited to the White House. Theodore Roosevelt became Franklin Roosevelt not only his fifth cousin, but he was his uncle-in-law, because Franklin Roosevelt married Eleanor Roosevelt, who then became Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt, and she was Theodore Roosevelt's niece. Now the Roosevelts, they didn't have much compunction about marrying cousins. Admittedly, fifth cousin, so no big deal. But nonetheless, as Theodore Roosevelt said to Franklin Roosevelt on his wedding day, "Well, Franklin, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family." Franklin Roosevelt had been watching Theodore Roosevelt and thinking, you know, I could be president someday. I'm as smart as Uncle Ted. I'm as popular as Uncle Ted. If he could be president, so can I. So he was watching Uncle Ted and watching how the enthusiasm for the war against Spain fizzled out, and how the American people turned against the whole notion of expansion that the war against Spain was premised on.